The last thing Marcus Cole's daughter said to him before he left for work was, "Daddy, am I going to be okay?" She was 9 years old. She had tubes in her arm and a machine next to her bed that beeped every time her oxygen dropped below 90. She asked him this every morning, not because she expected a real answer, but because she needed to hear his voice say yes before she could get through the day. And every morning, Marcus smiled at her with everything he had, kissed her forehead, and said, "You're going to be more than okay, baby. I promise." Then he walked out to the parking lot, sat in his car for 60 seconds, and let himself feel what he couldn't show her. The terror, the exhaustion, the weight of a man carrying something so heavy that some days he couldn't feel his own hands. Then he drove to work. His name was Marcus Cole. He was 44 years old. He had a PhD in international relations from Georgetown University. He had spent 11 years as a senior diplomatic interpreter for the United Nations, working in 7 countries, translating for heads of state, sitting in rooms where history was being made. He had been fluent in 8 languages since he was 32. He had been, by every measure anyone who knew him could think of, extraordinary. And every morning at 5:30 a.m., he put on a gray uniform and mopped the floors of Harrington Global, a financial services corporation on the 42nd floor of a downtown office building. Because the cleaning shift started at 5:30, ended at 2, paid $14 an hour, and included health insurance. The health insurance was the only reason any of it mattered. His daughter's name was Lily. She had been diagnosed with a rare pulmonary condition at age 6. Without the medication, without the specialists, without the twice-weekly treatments at the children's hospital across town, she would not make it to 12. With them, she had a chance. The treatments cost $4,000 a month after insurance. Marcus worked 2 jobs and had not slept more than 5 hours in a single night for 3 years. He never told anyone at Harrington Global any of this. He came in, he cleaned, he kept his head down. He went home to his daughter. What he couldn't control was Brian Sloan. Brian was 36, operations manager for the 42nd floor, and the kind of man who had confused authority with intelligence sometime in his early 20s and never recovered from the mistake. He had never worked a job where his hands got dirty. He wore shirts that were slightly too tight across the shoulders and talked about his MBA the way people talked about war medals. He had been at Harrington for 4 years, and in that time had made exactly one significant contribution. He had driven out 3 good employees and replaced them with people who were afraid of him, which he interpreted as leadership. From Brian's first week managing the floor, Marcus had existed as his favorite target. It started small, the way Brian would walk past Marcus without acknowledging him. Not out of distraction, but out of deliberate performance, showing everyone watching that the man with the mop did not register on his radar. Then came the comments, loud enough for the open-plan floor to hear. "Can someone make sure the cleaning crew actually cleans the boardroom this time? I found a smear on the window yesterday that's been there since Tuesday." He would say this to the air, to no one in particular, but always when Marcus was within earshot. Always when other people were around to absorb the message. This man is not doing his job. When Marcus cleaned something twice, which he did because he was meticulous and always had been, Brian would point it out. "You've been on that section for 20 minutes. Are we paying you to stare at it?" When Marcus moved efficiently through a space, Brian would follow behind him and find the one thing, any one thing, to criticize. A mark on a baseboard, a recycling bin slightly misaligned. Once, memorably, a single fingerprint on a glass door that Marcus had already cleaned and that a lawyer had touched in the 30 seconds between Marcus finishing and Brian arriving. "This is the problem," Brian said that day, in front of 5 lawyers and 2 junior analysts who all found something very interesting to look at on their phones. "We pay for professional cleaning and we get this. Does anyone actually supervise the facilities team? Because I'm starting to think the answer is no." Marcus stood there with his cleaning cloth. He felt his jaw tighten. He thought about his daughter asking him that morning if she was going to be okay. He thought about the insurance card in his wallet. He breathed in through his nose and out through his mouth and said nothing, because saying nothing was the thing that kept the job, and keeping the job kept Lily alive. But it cost him something every time. It cost him a piece of the man he used to be. The other cleaning staff noticed. Elena, who worked the 41st floor and sometimes shared a break room with Marcus, said to him once, "You let him talk to you like that every single day, and you never say anything? How do you do that?" Marcus looked at his coffee. "I have a daughter," he said. That was the whole answer. If you've ever swallowed your pride to protect someone you love, please subscribe. Because what happens next in this story is for every person who ever stayed quiet when they deserved to speak. The Harrington Global International Summit had been on the calendar for 6 months. It was the most important event the company had hosted in a decade. 17 delegations from 12 countries. A potential joint venture deal worth $300 million. The CEO, Richard Harrington, had personally overseen every detail of the planning. The 42nd floor had been transformed. The main conference room expanded into the adjacent space. New furniture, new AV systems, catering flown in from 3 cities, and 12 professional interpreters hired at significant expense to cover the languages of all 17 delegations. Marcus knew about the summit. Everyone who worked on 42 knew about the summit. Brian had been reminding them for weeks. This floor needs to be immaculate. We have international guests. I don't want to see a single streak on any window. I don't want any cleaning carts visible after 7 a.m. And I want every single person on the facilities team to understand that if something goes wrong this week, it falls on them. He had looked directly at Marcus when he said this. Marcus had looked back, said nothing, and pushed his cart toward the hallway. The summit began on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, things were already going wrong. The first interpreter, a French specialist, called in sick at 7 a.m. They found a replacement by 9. The replacement for the Mandarin interpreter got stuck in traffic and arrived 40 minutes late to the opening session, meaning the Chinese delegation spent the first hour of introductions relying on a junior associate's halting conversational Mandarin, which was catastrophically insufficient for a room full of senior executives negotiating financial contracts. The delegate from Guangzhou looked like a man doing vigorous mental arithmetic to contain his frustration. By Tuesday evening, the Arabic specialist had a family emergency and had to leave. The Japanese interpreter made a significant error in translation during a preliminary discussion about liability clauses that had to be corrected on the fly by a member of the Japanese delegation, which created an awkward 20-minute pause while everyone recalibrated their trust in the interpretation process. By Wednesday morning, the summit was in quiet crisis. 3 interpreters were now unavailable. The replacement agency they called could only provide 2 substitutes, neither of whom covered Mandarin at a professional financial level. The Swiss-German delegation was partially fine. The Korean delegation was managing on internal translation but losing nuance in every exchange. The Emirati delegation was politely, icily waiting. Richard Harrington called Brian at 8 a.m. and used a tone of voice that Brian had never heard from him before. "Fix it," Harrington said. "I don't care how. Fix it before the 9 o'clock session or this entire week is a catastrophe." Brian spent 45 minutes on the phone. He called 6 agencies. He called the interpreters who had already called in sick or left. He called the university language department and got a voicemail. He called 3 freelancers he found online. 2 didn't answer. 1 was available, but only for Spanish. At 8:52 a.m., Brian was standing in the hallway outside the main conference room, looking like a man who was about to be swallowed by the floor. The 9 o'clock session started in 8 minutes. The Mandarin and Arabic delegations were already seated inside. He had nothing. Marcus came around the corner with his cart at 8:53. He was heading to restock the supply closet near the service entrance. He had been on the floor since 5:30. He had cleaned every surface, emptied every recycling bin, polished every glass panel. He had done his job. He was invisible, the way Brian had always wanted him to be. He would have kept walking. He would have gone to the supply closet, finished his restocking, and started on the afternoon tasks. He had learned, over 18 months at Harrington, to keep moving and keep his eyes forward. But the doors of the conference room were open, and he could hear the sound coming from inside. He had spent 11 years of his life in rooms like that one. He knew exactly what that sound was. It was the sound of people with important things to say and no way to say them to each other. It was the sound of a conversation collapsing in real time. He stopped. He looked through the open doors. The Mandarin delegation sat on one side, their body language tight, contained. The Emirati delegation was on the other side, their senior representative's expression professionally neutral in a way that Marcus recognized as barely controlled irritation. A junior Harrington associate was standing at the front of the room with a tablet, clearly trying to find a translation app that could handle financial terminology, clearly failing. "We're going to have to reschedule the 9 o'clock, Brian said behind Marcus, to no one in particular, his voice strained. "I don't see another option. I've called every agency. Rescheduling will insult them," Marcus said. Brian turned. He stared at Marcus the way you stare at a piece of furniture that has suddenly asked you a question. "Excuse me?" "The Guangzhou delegation flew 14 hours, Marcus said. He was looking at the room, not at Brian. "If you tell them the session is postponed because you couldn't secure interpretation, they will read it as disrespect. You'll lose them before the negotiations even begin." Brian's expression moved through confusion into its more familiar territory, irritation. "No one asked for your input. Go finish whatever you were." Marcus walked past him into the conference room. Brian's mouth actually fell open. The junior associate at the front of the room looked up, with the desperate expression of a drowning person seeing something that might be a boat. Marcus set his cart against the wall by the door. He walked to the front of the room. He looked at the senior delegate from Guangzhou, a man named Wei Jianming, who had the kind of face that had sat across from many tables and was very good at reading what was on the other side of them. Marcus looked at him directly and said in Mandarin, "Mr. Wei, I apologize for the disruption to your morning. I would like to offer my assistance as interpreter for this session, if you'll permit it. I understand you have significant matters to discuss and your time is valuable." The room went absolutely silent. Wei Jianming looked at Marcus, at the gray uniform, at the cart by the door, then back at Marcus's face. Something shifted in Wei's expression. Not surprise exactly, but a very specific kind of attention. The attention of a man who has just recalibrated what he's looking at. He replied in Mandarin, "Your accent is excellent. Where did you study?" "I lived in Beijing for 3 years, Marcus said, and Chengdu for 1. I worked as a diplomatic interpreter." Wei was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Please proceed." Marcus turned to the Emirati delegation. He looked at their senior representative, a man named Khalid al-Rashidi, whom Marcus had identified the moment he walked in by the specific style of his formal dress and the quiet authority with which he occupied his chair. Marcus addressed him in Arabic, Gulf dialect. "Your Excellency, forgive the delay. I hope you will allow me to serve as interpreter for both delegations today. I want to make sure nothing important is lost between you." Al-Rashidi looked at him for a long moment. Then the corners of his eyes crinkled slightly. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one. He replied in Arabic, "A man who cleans floors and speaks Arabic. Tell me, what else don't you do?" "I also speak Japanese, Korean, French, Russian, and Portuguese," Marcus said in Arabic, "though none of them are needed in this room today." Al-Rashidi did smile then. He gestured toward the head of the table. "Please," he said, Sit." Brian Sloan was standing in the doorway. He had not moved since Marcus walked past him. He was watching the conference room, the delegation settling into their chairs, Marcus pulling out a seat at the head of the table, the junior associate stepping back with visible relief, with an expression that could not decide what it wanted to be: confusion, disbelief. And underneath both of those, something that was beginning to feel uncomfortably like the realization that he had misunderstood something fundamental for a very long time. The 9 o'clock session began 4 minutes late. It ran for 3 hours. Marcus translated in real time between Mandarin and Arabic, and twice in Japanese when a third delegate joined the call remotely from Tokyo. He caught a terminology error in the preliminary contract language that would have created a significant liability misunderstanding, flagged it in both languages, and allowed both parties to correct it before it became a structural problem in the agreement. He facilitated a tense exchange about exclusivity terms by finding a phrasing in Arabic that carried the exact legal weight the Emirati delegation needed while accurately reflecting the Harrington position. He kept both rooms in the conversation simultaneously, reading the body language of each side, knowing when to summarize and when to translate verbatim, knowing when a pause was diplomatic and when it was discomfort. He had done this for 11 years. He had never forgotten how. At 12:15, Richard Harrington himself walked into the conference room. He had been briefed by his assistant that the interpreter crisis had been resolved. He had not been told how. He walked in expecting to find one of the agency replacements at the head of the table. He stopped when he saw Marcus. He looked at the Harrington uniform. He looked at the table, where Wei Jianming was leaning forward with the engaged posture of a man who has found his counterpart worth talking to, and where al-Rashidi was listening with the focused calm of someone who trusts the channel his words are moving through. Harrington's assistant, who had followed him in, leaned toward him and said in a low voice, "It's one of the cleaning staff, sir. He apparently just walked in and started translating. The delegations accepted him." Harrington watched for a moment. He watched Marcus deliver a complex passage about profit-sharing structures in Mandarin, then pivot immediately to Arabic without breaking stride, without losing the thread, without a single moment of hesitation. He said to his assistant, "Find out everything about him." At 2 p.m., the morning session closed. Both delegations were satisfied. The preliminary framework for the $300 million joint venture was intact. Wei Jianming shook hands with the Harrington VP across the table, something that had looked genuinely unlikely 4 hours earlier. Al-Rashidi accepted a lunch invitation he had been politely declining since Monday. As the room cleared, Marcus stood to go. He had a card in the hallway and an afternoon schedule. His shift ended at 2, and Lily's treatment was at 4. He needed to be there. "Mr. Cole." It was Richard Harrington's voice from the doorway. Marcus turned. Harrington was 62, silver-haired, the kind of man who had built something real and knew exactly what it cost. He was looking at Marcus the way Wei Jianming had looked at him, the specific attention of someone recalibrating what they're seeing. "Can I have 5 minutes?" Marcus looked at his watch. "I have somewhere I need to be at 4. Harrington blinked. In 30 years of running a company, very few people had said that to him in response to a request for 5 minutes. He found, to his surprise, that it made him like the man more. "5 minutes," he said. "I promise." They sat at the now empty conference table. Harrington's assistant hovered near the door. Brian Sloan was somewhere in the hallway. Marcus had seen him pacing outside the glass during the morning session, unable to leave, unable to come in. "How long have you worked here?" Harrington asked. 18 months, Marcus said. "And before this?" 11 years as a senior diplomatic interpreter for the United Nations. 4 postings in Asia, 2 in the Middle East, 1 in Eastern Europe. He said it simply, without performance. It was information. "My wife died 3 years ago. My daughter was diagnosed with a pulmonary condition when she was 6. She needed consistent care and health insurance. This job provided both. Harrington was quiet for a moment. You left the UN for a cleaning position. I left the UN for my daughter, Marcus said. The cleaning position was what was available. The room was very quiet. What you did this morning, Harrington said, saved a deal that I have been building for 2 years. The Guangzhou delegation was already considering withdrawing. Al-Rashidi had one more meeting in him before he went home, and we never heard from him again. You didn't just interpret, you held the room together. He paused. I'd like to offer you a position. Director of International Relations, effective immediately. Salary commensurate with your experience. Full benefits for your family. Marcus looked at him. My daughter has significant medical needs. The coverage would need to include— Give me the list, Harrington said. Whatever she needs. Marcus's throat tightened. He had spent 3 years keeping that tightness hidden. He let it be visible now, just for a moment, because he was sitting across from a man who had just offered his daughter something that mattered more than anything Marcus could name. I'd need to review the offer in writing, he said. Of course, Harrington said. He stood. He extended his hand. Marcus stood and shook it. Harrington looked at him with the direct gaze of someone who had earned the right to say what he was about to say. I owe you an apology. You've been on this floor for 18 months. We should have known who you were. He paused. I should have known who you were. It was at this moment that Brian Sloan appeared in the doorway. He had been waiting outside. He had seen the conversation through the glass. He had watched Harrington shake Marcus's hand. His face had gone through several stages during the past 4 hours and had arrived somewhere that was pale and still, the expression of a man watching the architecture of his own certainty come apart. Brian, Harrington said, turning. His voice had changed. It was not angry. It was something more precise than anger. Come in. Brian came in. He looked at Marcus, then at Harrington, then at his own hands. I've spent the last 20 minutes reviewing Marcus's personnel file, Harrington said, and I've had some conversations with people on the floor. He let that land. I understand you've had some interactions with him over the past 18 months. Brian's jaw worked. I was managing the facilities team to a standard. I've heard what you were doing, Harrington said quietly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. I've also heard about what you weren't doing, which is treating people who work in this building with basic professional respect. He looked at Brian steadily. We're going to need to have a longer conversation, but I want you to understand something right now, in this room, because I think it's important that you hear it here. He nodded toward Marcus. This man has forgotten more about international communication than either of us will ever know. He has been showing up to this building every morning for 18 months, doing work that was beneath his qualifications, with more dignity and professionalism than I have seen from people who were paid 10 times what we were paying him. And you spent those 18 months trying to make him feel like he didn't belong here. Brian said nothing. You do not have a management position at this company anymore, Harrington said. HR will meet with you this afternoon. Brian looked at Marcus one more time. Marcus looked back. He didn't feel satisfaction exactly. He felt something quieter and more complete than that. The particular piece of a man who stayed true to himself through something very hard and came out the other side still recognizable. I hope your daughter gets better, Brian said. It came out strange, too small for the room, but Marcus heard something real in it. She will, Marcus said. Brian left. Harrington looked at Marcus. I'll have the offer letter sent to your email by end of day. Marcus nodded. I have to go, he said. Treatment at 4. He picked up his cart from the wall where he'd left it 3 hours ago. He wheeled it to the supply closet, finished his restocking, changed out of his uniform in the locker room, and walked to his car in the parking garage. He sat in the car for 60 seconds, the way he always did. But this time, what he let himself feel was different. Not terror. Not the weight. Something he hadn't felt in 3 years. A loosening, somewhere behind his sternum, like a knot being untied by careful hands. He drove to the children's hospital. Lily was awake when he arrived, sitting up in bed with a book, the machine beside her beeping its steady rhythm. She looked up when he came in, and her face did what it always did when she saw him. It became simply, completely happy. "Daddy," she said. "Hey, baby." He sat on the edge of her bed and took her hand. Her fingers were small and warm. "Did you have a good day?" she asked. Marcus looked at his daughter, her thin shoulders, her bright eyes, the tubes he hated and the machine he was grateful for. The life that was entirely worth every single floor he had ever mopped, and every word he had ever swallowed, and every morning he had driven to that building and put on that uniform and been invisible so that she could have what she needed. "Yeah," he said, "I had a good day." She leaned her head against his arm. "Tell me about it." So he did. If this story moved you, please hit that subscribe button. And tell me in the comments, have you ever met someone who turned out to be completely different from what you assumed? Because people like Marcus are everywhere. We just have to learn to look.